Welcome to Chain Reaction, the Foreign Policy Research Institute's flagship network of podcast series examining the political, security, economic, and social trends shaping Europe and Eurasia. Throughout the year, we're talking with experts about developments in Russia's war in Ukraine, the new European security order, the past, present, and future of the Baltic states, Russia's political economy, and great power competition in the region. Join us each month for
Bear Market Brief.
The understanding of Russia, which is broadly as Russia as a great power that has its own special path, that has a mission, and that needs a strong state, and a different path to that of the West.
I think when you look at these other industries, what you find is that there's a lot of pain built up in different parts of the Russian economy. Some of it's only going to be felt over a longer period of time.
Baltic ways.
There were the countries that when the war started, they were willing to be, those voices of moral conscience.
The continent.
I think that this conflict today proves that we are able to go past grievances and that we are able to look into the future, into the common future together.
Report in short.
This is the real Achilles heel of Putin's mobilization.
And of course, our flagship, Chain Reaction.
These two countries are interacting militarily, or have been interacting in several different conflicts, and in some cases they're on the same side, and in some cases they're not.
New episodes are available each week on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. This week on the continent.
I'd be willing to make a bet, a small one at least, that many of you who have been following the war in Ukraine over the last year and a half or so have once or twice maybe looked at a map of the country. Maybe some of you listening are going ahead and doing so now. So if you have looked at a map of Ukraine, or are looking at one now, you'll notice tucked in there, just to the left of Ukraine, is the country of Moldova. I'm Aaron Schwartzbaum, and this is The Continent, a podcast dedicated to the impact of the war in Ukraine across Europe. How is the war affecting politics, society, and security? Moldova is an unusual and interesting case here, not least because it's a neighbor of Ukraine, but also because much of what you're going to hear on this episode may seem a little familiar. There are a lot of dynamics in Moldova that I, at least, found to be parallel refractions of some of the politics and divides we've seen in Ukraine. Regional, language, politics between East and West. It was honestly kind of familiar. Joining us today is specialist in real Moldovan, Dr. Ecaterina Locoman. Dr. Locoman is a senior lecturer in international studies at the Lauder Institute, University of Pennsylvania. She teaches in the global program with a focus on international order making, the study of international relations, and comparative politics. Her research agenda focuses on comparative foreign policy analysis, the politics of alliance formation, mass media, and public opinion. This is Apocalypse Chisinau. Ecaterina, welcome to the Continent podcast. Great to have you with us today.
Very pleased to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
So let's start with a quick introduction of yourself. What keeps you busy these days?
I am a senior lecturer in international studies at the University of Pennsylvania. I teach in the global program here at the Lauder Institute. And I am also responsible for the curricular development of the capstone seminar here, helping joint degree students write their master theses. But I also do research. So I study the foreign policy choices of the post-communist states in Europe. Currently work on a book manuscript on the divergent foreign policy choices of the post-communist states after the fall of the Soviet Union. And for this research, I studied the diplomatic archives in Kiev and in Chisinau, and I interviewed former political leaders there. So I'm gathering all the information from this research, from this fieldwork that I conducted, and I'm trying to compile it into a book manuscript.
Well, we could talk about the decisions foreign policy-wise and other of post-communist states for hours and hours. Unfortunately, today we only have about 30 minutes. So let's dive into talking about Moldova. Help me learn here. So I like to ask at the beginning of these episodes the Mr. Rogers question: who are the people in your neighborhood? So for folks who are not familiar with Moldovan politics, let's set the stage. who are the key figures and blocks we need to know about right now?
So, politics in Moldova, I like to think about it, is divided into those who are on the pro Western, pro European side, and those who are on the pro Russia side. So like political lines are divided. According to geopolitical lines. So on the pro-Western side, we have the most important, I would say, political party right now in Moldova because it's the governing party. It's called the Party of Action and Solidarity. Maya Sandu, who is the current president of Moldova, is the leader of this party. And the party currently has about 63 members in the Moldovan parliament. So has the majority, it was able to kind of form the government and lead the country. On the pro-Western side, another party promoting the EU integration is the Coalition for Unity and Welfare, led by Moldova's former ambassador to the US, Igor Munteanu. But this party is smaller in polls, so it's not garnering as much support. Now, on the pro-Russia side, the opposition parties, we have three large parties, right? So we have the Party of Socialists, whose leader was the former Moldovan president Igor Dodon. We have the Shor Party. Ilan Shor, its leader, was convicted of fraud in Moldova over the theft of $1 billion from 3 Moldovan banks. So he's now hiding somewhere abroad. We don't know exactly where it is. Some people say he's in Israel. We don't exactly know where he is. And then the Party of Communists is also a strong opposition party to the current government. So I would also say that another important player in Moldovan politics is the current mayor of the capital city, Chisinau. His name is Ion Ceban, and he is a former prominent member of the Party of Socialists. So he was very close to the former Moldovan president Igor Dodon. But then when he was elected to the mayor's office in Chisinau, he created his own party. And so he, with his new party, is positioning himself on this pro-Western side, right? So he's promoting EU integration. He says that, the place of Moldova is in the EU, but, a lot of people are kind of skeptic about this positionality because the US Treasury published a report last year where, the information was shared that he and some of his associates receive financial support from the Kremlin. So, maybe this is a tactic that he's using to kind of steal votes from the pro-Western electorate. I've recently been to Moldova for the first time in 5 years. And as the mayor, he's been the mayor of Chisinau for several years now, and I could see that the city is improved very well, right? So it's much cleaner, much nicer. So he is doing a lot of things in order to kind of gain a lot of support. So the next kind of important dates to look in Moldovan politics are November this year, when local elections are going to be organized. So kind of political parties will be able to see, who is the next one. Because if you usually gain a lot at the local elections, then you kind of hope that you will get more at the parliamentary and then the presidential elections. And then we have presidential elections next year and then parliamentary elections in 2025.
So lots of interesting aspects there. I try to avoid sweeping generalizations, but it seems like what you mentioned rhymes a little bit. Probably not the same with Ukraine, at least before this latest Russian invasion. Now, I guess a question about that. So in Ukraine, we saw the kind of pro-Western, pro-Russia divide along largely regional lines, maybe some demographic factors there. Who tends to be in the pro-Western camp or pro-Russian camp in Moldova? Is it regional? Is it purely demographic? How does that break down? And do you happen to know percentages? Does it kind of go back and forth between administrations? What's the layout there?
That's a very good question. So it's not as regionally divided. Moldova is not as regionally divided as Ukraine. Of course, we have the Transnistria region, which I can talk a little bit later. It's a separatist region that broke away from Moldova back in 1992 after a short but brutal war. So if we talk about like pure regional divide, yes, Transnistria would be. But then, in Transnistria, because of the conflict and everything, we don't really know how much of those votes really decide internal politics in Moldova proper. Now, in Moldova proper, I would say that the division is according, I think, mostly to age the demographic would be, right? So the younger people are more pro-Western, more educated are more pro-Western. People who live in the more rural areas, unfortunately, tend to have this nostalgic view about, Soviet Union, so they tend to be a little bit more old, more pro-Russia views. Now, for the entire period of Moldova's independence history since 1991, there was this poll question that people in Moldova would be asked: if next Sunday there would be a referendum and you would need to choose whether Moldova would join European Union or Russia's customs union, which one would you vote for? Right. So for the most period of time, the division would be half and half, right? So half of the society would be pro EU, they would vote for pro EU integration. Half of the society would vote for Russia. After the war in Ukraine, these numbers a little bit changed. So the percentages for pro-Western integration increased. And this, I think, was also important because of the role that Russian mass media played in Moldova throughout its independence history, right? So most of up until last year, I think, Moldovan citizens, Moldovan viewers could receive free, non-stop, news from Russia. And because, again, of this nostalgic views and this legacies of the Soviet Union, people used to like the content from the Russian TV news. And then, so this propaganda also influenced their views. Now, because that is the TV broadcasting from Russia is kind of banned, people are getting a little bit more balanced information in terms of this geopolitical divides.
Very interesting, and I think raises further questions. So you had mentioned Transnistria. I think that certainly deserves our attention, being a very uniquely post-Soviet phenomenon, this frozen conflict. Maybe the case that the Kremlin is hoping Ukraine also becomes a similarly frozen conflict these days. But can you bring us up to speed about the history of this Transnistrian conflict, where it stands now, and a prospect for, if not reintegration, certainly rapprochement? Where does that stand?
So yeah, Transnistria has been a sore point for Moldovan politics because we were kind of stuck. We are stuck because we cannot, for 30 years, we are unable to solve the conflict. So it happened in 1992, basically, when there were talks in Moldova, in Chisinau, right after the independence and declaration of, sovereignty and independence. There were talks, some people, some unionist circles, I would say that would call for Moldova's unification with Romania. Now, of course, Transnistria was a region in Moldova that was mostly, populated by, I would say, ethnic Ukrainians, ethnic Russians. So a lot of the people there, like the political elite, was kind of like against this. So they tried to break away from Moldova and create their own region. A war broke out between Chisinau and Tiraspol, and I remember I was studying the archival documents in the Parliament of Moldova, and at the beginning of this conflict, the tide was in favor of Chisinau, up until the Russian 14th Army got involved in the war. So then, of course, the military forces were not equal, and the Moldovan President Mircea Snegur had to sign a peace and kind of freeze the conflict. So the military kind of fight stopped, but then the political this attempt to solve the conflict politically kind of continues up to this day. Now, one thing that I remember from the archives when I was reading, and when this active fighting was happening, at one point a former minister of internal affairs in Moldova was kind of giving orders and explaining to the upper echelons of the leadership in Moldova what was going on. At one point, I remember in the archives, he said, "We are actually fighting for the Russian army. We are not fighting the separatists in Transnistria." And then when, again, the political leadership in Moldova realized that, they had to back down. So since then, we are in this trial to solve the conflict. There were different attempts. So the biggest attempt, I would say, to solve the conflict happened in after 2000, when Vladimir Putin came to Kremlin and became the president of Russia. And one of his political, advisors, Kozak, tried to, there was this called the Kozak plan. He tried to kind of create a plan in which Moldova would be federalized and Transnistria would become federative subject of Moldova, but it would have the right to decide Moldova's political foreign policy, basically. So, but then, the Western partners of Moldova, the United States, and then I studied this, they were kind of against us. And then Moldovan president, there is even like a lot of information on that Vladimir Putin was on his way on his plane in Moscow to come to Chisinau to sign the Cossack memorandum and kind of put an end to the conflict in Transnistria. But then Vladimir Voronin, which was then the Moldovan president, called last minute and said, I cannot sign this, so we cannot kind of take this to an end. So since then, again, Transnistria remains in this gray zone where it is not recognized by any country. It's not even recognized by Russia, but still it receives subsidies from Russia, so that's how it can survive economically. There are currently about 2,000 peacekeepers in Transnistria. They are mostly this legacy again from the 14th Russian Army. And Transnistria houses one of the largest ammunition depots in Eastern Europe and Kobasna, right? So I was even, reading when the war in Ukraine unfortunately started, there was this fear that, God forbid, by mistake, a missile is fired in Kobasna, then like a tragedy can happen because all of that armament can just start exploding and nobody knows what would happen to Moldova or to Transnistria.
So I guess two related questions about the security space, not even on the technical side. So we had this legacy, Soviet and then Russian force that was based in Transnistria, this 14th Army. Why did Russia choose to intervene?
Yeah, because I think it's the same playbook that Russia is playing with the other post-Soviet countries in the region. It wants to still maintain a strong grip on the political fate of these countries. It doesn't kind of want to let these countries go away from its influence. So making sure that there is a frozen conflict, this is kind of a lever that it has, and then it can influence politics in Moldova proper. So, the war in Ukraine, kind of the way in which it ends, has a very big implications about Transnistria and about Moldova's fate. Because if it ends in Ukraine's favor, then it's much easier to kind of incorporate Transnistria into Moldova proper. But if it doesn't end in Ukraine's favor, then it's very clear that that these countries would just forever be in Russia's sphere of influence.
So I certainly did hear talk about a potential accidental or intentional Ukrainian strike on Transnistria. There's Russian military base there. Ukraine may not have forces to spare, but if it did, it could, I think, pretty easily kind of remove that token from the equation. Has been pretty quiet as far as I've followed. But there's also talk during the war of Russia in a sweeping move landing in Odessa and rolling on up and liberating, quote unquote, but taking Transnistria to, if not the whole of the country. Has there been talk, as there has been in a lot of other European countries, about mobilization of some kind or building a stronger military? Is that something we've seen at all? Is there enough political consensus?
In Moldova, not so far, because I think the insecurity, the fear and the insecurity that people feel is very high, but there is no talk about, military mobilization so far. And at the beginning of this year, there were indeed fears that, Russia might try to attack Ukraine from the Transnistrian side. Now, as much as the public could learn from what, Maya Sandu, the Moldova's president and prime minister were sharing, they said that, they kind of try to calm down the population and say that we are trying to, maintain the security of the country. But so far, no, I didn't hear about any mobilization.
One other question about knock-on effects from the war. Have we seen any significant refugee flows? And Moldova's not a large country, and you think it wouldn't take a lot of Ukrainians to create, I don't want to say a burden, that may be a charged word, but kind of create a demographic change. What has that been like?
Yeah, so Moldova was indeed one of the countries that received the most refugees per capita, right? So Moldova is very tiny, 2.5 million people, I think we have officially registered. And we had, if I'm not mistaken, I don't want to say I remember at one point I was reading about 100,000 refugees crossing into Moldova. So in the first months when the war, broke out, yes, it was difficult because, the authorities needed to find resources to house those refugees, to help the children, to help the elderly. I think right now, I just came back from Moldova. I didn't really see a lot of movement, from what I understand, because the war in Ukraine changed and the front line moved a little bit to the east, farther away from Moldova's borders. A lot of the people moved back to Ukraine, back to Odessa, back to eastern. So I think that's one reason why. But I think, again, credit to Moldovan authorities. I think the way in which they, with support from Western partners, I think they dealt very well with the refugee crisis, and we were kind of managed to kind of help them as much as we could. People to people support was very big as well, because a lot of families in Moldova, people in Moldova have family in Ukraine, so they could kind of come and stay at families in Moldova. And another thing connected to this question, your earlier question about Transnistria, a lot of people in Transnistria have dual passports, right? So they live in Transnistria, they may have these pro-Russia views, but then they also have Ukrainian passports because they're so close to the border with Ukraine. So there were fears that maybe this conflict would escalate because of Transnistria, but thankfully, because I think people don't want war, people don't want violence, even in Transnistria, right? So they were the political elites even there were a little bit more rational in the sense of taming down this calls for violence and calls for escalating the conflict.
Very interesting. Let's pivot to my favorite segment of the day, the word of the day. But before we get there, I think we have a really interesting language situation that I wanted to ask you about. I love language politics. I love languages. So Moldova's still very bilingual, a lot of Russian speech and a lot of Romanian. What is the trend there? Is that something that has kind of continued following the Soviet Union's collapse? Is Romanian becoming more predominant? Is you say Ukrainian in Ukraine? What does that look like right now?
So yes, because of the Soviet legacy, Russian is like the lingua franca. Especially if you are in the cities, a lot of people speak Russian. It also may be a reminiscent fact from the Soviet Union. There are a lot of people during Soviet times, while Moldova was part of the Soviet Union, a lot of people from Ukraine or from Russia or from other post-Soviet republics would be sent to Moldova, and they would mostly settle into cities, right? So then, of course, kind of Russian was the language that they would speak. The ethnic Moldovans, they speak Romanian, right? So I would say that for a long period of time, again, language politics was this geopolitical divide. People could not agree, political elites could not agree. Is the language that we speak in Moldova Romanian or Moldovan? Again, this is an artifact which was created by Soviet Union to kind of during Soviet times to say that Moldova was different from Romania, and they would say that we don't speak Romania, that Romanian is different from Moldovan. And to prove that, during Soviet times, Moldovans would speak Romanian, but with the Cyrillic alphabet, right? So imagine you wouldn't use the Latin alphabet, but you would use the Cyrillic alphabet for all communication. Now, as I said, for most years, we were fighting as to how to call our language, to the point where the political elite at one point just gave up and said, okay, we'll just call it the state language. They would not call it Romanian, they would not call it Moldovan. And only this year, the PAS party, Maya Sandu's party, managed to kind of pass a law in parliament in which finally it was recognized that we speak Romanian. There's no difference between Moldovan and Romanian. There's no such thing as Moldovan language. So we speak Romanian. Now, Russian, again, as I said, is very commonly spoken in cities. And I look at it, and most Moldovans look at it as an advantage, because when you speak more foreign languages, this makes you smarter. Research shows this all the time, and encourage young kids to speak Russian, not because of course the way in which Russia leads its foreign policy with respect to the post-Soviet states is not always in the best interest of the smaller states. But then this is not a reason not to speak Russian.
Well, if I can editorialize, there is no such thing as a bad language. People do bad things. Languages are all fantastic. To that effect, let's talk about the word of the day. I asked you to pick a word in Russian, Romanian, or both that describes the current society, culture, political moment. What is your word and or words?
So I chose the word in Romanian, and I would say that the word is insecuritate or insecurity. Unfortunately, I thought for a while, and I would be like maybe vacillation, oscillation, but then no, I think it's insecuritate, insecurity. We have economic insecurity, high inflation, high energy prices. We have social insecurity, political and national insecurity, right? Because we have the war at the border, and a lot of people, economic insecurity in the sense that unfortunately a lot of the people from Moldova are still traveling to work abroad. Not a lot of them have the economic system is not as developed to provide everybody good salaries. So then they work in the European Union countries, and that's how they support their families.
Last question for you. I've read a few articles by now, and you had mentioned this earlier, about the possibility of Moldova with some of this insecurity, common language, possibly uniting with Romania. What are the politics around that? That seems like the kind of thing that would be in many other contexts very politically dicey. We're independent. We would give that up. So what is motivating that prospect? Is it a serious prospect, do you think?
Yes, so the problem of unification, I think, has created a lot of sore points in Moldova's relations with Russia. I think every time when politicians in Russia hear about Moldova unifying with Romania, this is a very historical, I think, again, legacy from Second World War, because in the interwar period, Moldova was part of Romania, right? So that was the only period in modern time when Moldova was part of Romania. So there is this, right after when Moldova gained its independence, there was this strive by political elites to unite back with Romania. How serious that is right now, I am not sure, because most of the strongest political parties kind of gave up on this unification message. And they say that Moldova can be unified with Romania in the European Union. So rather than go and unify with Romania right now, the Maya Sandu's party kind of chose this message of let's join the European Union, and in the European family we kind of can be together with. And this is a strategic move, I think, because again, in terms of politics and political preferences, more people want Moldova to stay independent rather than unify with Romania. And I think it's also because of the Soviet legacy and the fact that for the period when Moldova was part of the Soviet Union, Romania was not spoken in positive terms among Moldovans, right? Because of the propaganda that was and disinformation, right? So I think that even in terms of political preferences and voter preferences, if there was a referendum, I think more people would still want Moldova to stay independent rather than unify with Romania. I don't think there is enough willingness, political willingness in Chisinau. And I don't think there is enough willingness even in Bucharest, in Romania's capital, to kind of have this. There would have to be a referendum in both in both countries. And I just don't think currently that there is a chance for that. And again, I would end maybe with this, that by promoting this message of unifying with Romania, I think it only escalates the issues with Russia. So I think that it is wise of the current Moldovan leadership to kind of take this more European integration path rather than unification with Romania, which would be a shortcut, of course. We would automatically be part of NATO and part of the EU. But again, would the Western partners allow Romania to do that? I don't know. So I would leave it at that.
Questions remain. Ecaterina, thank you for joining today. Really learned a lot.
Thank you very much again for having me.
Thanks again to Dr. Locoman for joining. I really learned a lot this episode, and I hope you, listener, did as well. Did you see some of the parallels I did between Moldova and Ukraine? Feel free to reach out and let me know. The Continent Podcast is brought to you by FPRI, the Foreign Policy Research Institute, a nonpartisan think tank based in Philadelphia. For more information on this initiative and on many others, be sure to visit fpri.org. We'll catch you next time.